Over the last few years, it can seem as though democracy has taken a bit of a beating.
Whether it's far-right thinkers like Curtis Yarvan openly arguing for monarchy, or left-wing critiques that question whether the masses can really be trusted with power, the idea of democracy as the only legitimate form of government suddenly doesn't feel as solid as it once did.
Recently, Donald Trump has been called king-like, and not just because of his personality. His own supporters have started leaning into the aesthetic, posting AI-generated images of Trump in golden robes with a crown on his head. It's easy to dismiss this as internet trolling, but something deeper really might be happening. Something about how people are thinking about authority, stability, who gets to rule, and how they get to do it.
And that got me thinking about an idea I've been turning over in my head for quite a while, which might sound a little strange for someone who teaches democracy and human rights for a living.
Tom, you're really going to say this in public?
Absolutely. I think constitutional monarchy, the kind where a royal family exists but doesn't have much actual power, is actually the best form of government we could come up with.
Well, I'm sort of thinking this sounds like a high school civics debate or an episode of The Crown.
Yeah, but think about the countries which are constitutional monarchies. Besides the United Kingdom, which comes to everyone's mind, you have countries like Sweden or Denmark or Canada or the Netherlands or Spain. They don't seem like bad places to live. And the fact is they're all stable democracies, and I think that the symbolic role of the monarch might actually strengthen the democracy, not weaken it.
Okay, so in this episode, we're going to dig into what monarchy actually is, its different forms, how it works, and why it persists in so many places. And why, in an age where democracy might be wobbling, Tom is starting to wonder whether democratic monarchy might offer something surprising. Tom, I feel like every time we talk, we're in a completely new and different landscape. You know, the last few episodes that we've released have been very much responsive to crises in the moment. And I came out of my little hermit hole recently to find this kind of discussion about whether or not Donald Trump is our new king. And Trump saying, like, I can't possibly be king. It's far too difficult to get things done that I want to get done. So I don't know. I guess my first question to you is just, what is your reaction to that conversation? Is it just more absurdity? Or is there something that people were picking up on in the way that Trump is understanding his role in power? And is there any truth to the accusation that Trump is functioning as a king?
Wow. Okay, that's a lot there. I mean, it is interesting that we're starting to see this idea of monarchy kind of emerge in discourse. And, you know, one source of that is some people on the hard right, a guy named Curtis Yarvan, who is getting a lot of attention in these, circles for proposing that, absolute monarchy is actually the best form of government, and that's what we should have. Democracy's got all these problems. It's hard to get things done. You got to get agreement. You got to convince people. What we really need is a righteous king, a benevolent dictator in the form of a monarchy. So that's, one sort of strand of it. And the other, of course, is in the very successful protests a couple weeks ago called the No King's Day, which I thought was excellent framing by protesters. And, hundreds of thousands of people turned up in many, many American cities to say that basically, we don't want a monarchy. We fought a revolutionary war over this, and that's why it's good framing. It's so deeply American to be Republican. Republican in the technical sense means a country with a head of state who is, not a king, who is chosen by the people or by, politicians somehow, and who doesn't pass on power to their children. Monarchy, for our purposes, you could define as a system of government where power is hereditary and usually will stay with a single family, at least for a while. And then there's a really interesting set of distinctions about what kind of monarchy you have.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, in some ways this conversation feels so precious, like I feel like we could be in an 8th grade history class. But the truth is, the truth is that it also is weirdly contemporary, because what it means to rule a country that you and I are really familiar with that has a pretty clear idea about the only form of government that we would allow, all of a sudden is having a bit of an identity crisis. And I do think that even if you don't think that Donald Trump is ruling as a king, there are king-like elements that I think a certain portion of the electorate were looking for, and those are manifesting. The sort of like there's a little bit of he's been invested with this sort of like superhuman like element to him. And that one of the justifications for having a monarchy was this idea that a family would have some kind of access to divinity, right? That they had been like blessed with the power to lead correctly. And even if you don't want to go that far, you can still imagine a situation where you just sort of think that the population thinks to themselves, like, this family knows how to rule us. And we've had elements of that here. I mean, there's a lot of people who wish that Michelle Obama would have run for president, And I think there is this sort of like this magical sense that there was like something about the Obamas that just made them good people, good leaders, good family. And that's not too far from what justifies a monarchy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We think of ourselves as being, radical democracy, and we, want no kings. But how many political dynasties do we have in the United States? Is it really the case that, two Adamses and two Bushes and a couple of Roosevelts, really
Some
were
Clintons.
the very best people at that time for government? So there are elements of it within democratic systems too.
Yeah. And I mean, if we were to be honest also about how even people end up in political office and leadership here in the United States, it does have to do with being in powerful positions in society anyway, right? Like you need a certain amount of money, for example, to even be able to run for office in a meaningful way. So there are a lot of other things that are still, I think, creating kind of a hierarchy that is connected to what justifies a monarchy. So we're talking about what was the justification for a monarchy, but let's talk about the decision-making process. So you actually draw a distinction between absolute monarchy and what you call a constitutional monarchy. Let's talk about what that difference is in terms of making those like real-world decisions that impact a population.
Right. So first of all, we tend to think because we're, Republicans in this sense, we live in a republic, that monarchy's like doomed to fade away in some, archaic form of government. How could the British still have that crazy institution? It turns out that more than 1/5 of countries today are ruled by monarchs at some level. They have a monarch as head of state. And so it's a very vital form of government. A lot of those are British Commonwealth countries, like Tuvalu, where I've spent a little time in the South Pacific, is still part of the Commonwealth, and the King Charles is the official head of state, and he governs through a governor general. That includes Australia and Canada. So you have those kind of countries. Then you have, of course, the Scandinavian countries and the so-called Benelux countries, and Japan and Spain. You go down the list, boy, those don't sound like bad places to live. They sound like pretty great, good countries. Those are all what we'd call constitutional monarchies. So in other words, you have a king or a royal family, queen, but they don't actually exercise any role in government. They just, go do ribbon cuttings and appear at ceremonial things. And actually, when you put it that way, it's not a very good job. You lose a lot of your rights. They really don't have freedom of speech, if you think about it. They don't have freedom of movement. They're kind of prisoners of society. We take this family, and let's take the royal family of England. It's really easy to see that they are prisoners, that we just use them to mock, and we follow their exploits, and, we might respect one and not another, but, it's not a very good life. And that's why we see people like Prince Harry leaving the whole thing. But anyway, that's all constitutional monarchy, where you have a lot of fancy trappings, but no real power. And that seems to be a pretty effective form of government. And I can say more about why I think so. I think it's a good form of government. So here you have this phenomenon, monarchy, which could either be the worst form of government or the best. And it all depends on whether you give these people any real power or not. So you might say then, like, why would we possibly want to have these, family up there? And what possible good could it do us to have them if they have no power? And here, there's a couple of phenomenon I've observed, which I think might explain, why these are very good and stable systems. So one thing is if you have someone whose job is to embody the nation, Queen Elizabeth is probably the best example that people would really recognize. Yeah, she was queen for so long. She embodied the United Kingdom. And, multiple generations of citizens of that country would think about, the queen and where she was in their own lives and things like this. If you got someone who does that, it puts a ceiling on populism. It's very interesting that we have Donald Trump. The United Kingdom had Boris Johnson, but he didn't get very far at all because there's no way he could make that claim, which we do hear from Trump from time to time, that he alone embodies the people. He is the only one who senses what the people really want. You can't say that if there's a king or queen. Those folks actually embody the nation. And so I think that puts an upper limit on populist appeal.
Wait, Tom, can I just stop you? Because I understand what you're saying, but I guess there is also a part of me that's like, how is that possible? So how can you have, like, just taking the British, I think is the one we're most familiar with, the richest, most out of touch family that's living in what you have acknowledged is like a really fancy prison. What is it that they're actually embodying? They understand what, random cobbler down the street needs. So what is the, because I think you are getting at something that's important, although I don't think it's actually that they know what the people need. I think it might be something else, but I want to hear what you mean when you say that the royalty in a constitutional democracy are embodying the people.
Tradition. That's what they are embodying. You're the one who brought up the cobbler, so I thought it was it is the sense of being British. What binds us all together with all our different plural things is that we share this experience of being under this system with these people. Now, in the United States, we have something that substitutes for that, which is a constitution.
Yeah.
But that's very rare. There are very few countries like ours. And so, if you don't have that, and particularly think about like an ethnically divided society, or one where there's a significant minority group, the king can really help integrate people and give them a sense that they're all part of the same country.
But I think that's so fascinating because what you're saying is that in a constitutional democracy, the royal family substitutes for a national identity or like defines the national identity. Whereas it's part of the national identity. And it could be in the UK, the national identity seems to be, or at least for some people, like something about tradition and holding on to history and continuity. Whereas in the United States, there also was a national identity. I'm not sure what it is now, but there was a very strong national identity, which was embodied in the Constitution, which was reflected in the way that the country was founded, which I think also was reflected in an embrace of immigration and difference and, all of these things, work hard and things will happen. Like there was a national identity that made it so that we didn't need a royal family to tell us what it was. We had another source, right?
Yeah.
What other sources of national identity do countries get? Because I'm trying to figure out like what it is that the royal family is actually doing and whether or not a state needs the royal family to do that.
Yeah, so here the idea that the king is the ruler of all of the subjects is really important. That can integrate people who otherwise might not be part of the country. I used to live in Thailand. I've spent a lot of time in Thailand. And Thailand's actually a very plural country, even though Thailand means the land of the Thais. The Thais are only one of the ethnic groups there. It's a Buddhist country, but you have a significant Muslim population in the south. You have these hill tribes in the north who are different ethnicities. And basically all of those people, even though they're not Thai, they're not members of the main ethnic group, they can signal their loyalty to the country by being loyal to the king. And the king protects them. And that's a very old historic role. You see that in a lot of different countries. It's, just in this regard, I was looking at Europe in World War II, and it turns out like the countries that were monarchies were much more protective of their Jewish subjects than republics. Like France basically served them up on a platter. the king of Morocco, which was a French, protectorate at the time, refused to give the country's Jewish population to the Vichy French, who wanted to deport them. And that's because he said, no, these are my subjects. I have to protect them. So there's like a bargain, you might say, between minorities who otherwise would not ontologically be part of the nation and the king. So I think that's one thing we get. I think another thing you can get is that, if the king is not involved in day-to-day politics, but is up there sort of above it all, then occasionally a king or queen, I should say, can step in and say, wait a minute, you guys are getting a little bit out of control here, you politicians. Get back in order. You can't do this. And we don't really know much about what happened with all the prime ministers' meetings with the Queen, which are so well documented in that Netflix series, The Crown.
Yeah.
But if you're to believe that, those conversations were real, and from time to time, the advice, as it's formally called, of the Queen would actually steer things in one way or another. At least according to that series, she prevented a coup. There's a famous story from Spain when the monarchy was restored after Franco in 1978, and a couple years later, some military officers were trying to have a coup, and the king played a major role in defeating the coup. He got on the radio and said, no, we have to stick with democratic government. So that's a role also, which I think, people might want, this idea that there's some kind of emergency lever that can be pulled to prevent the country from, completely falling apart when the politicians can't get along.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds attractive, right? And it seems like in your description, at least, the power that a king or a queen would have in that situation would be almost like the power of celebrity, or the power, it's like power over the population, because the population knows them, and because the population knows that they're going to stick around, and it's not just a matter of them being, elected again in the next cycle. But none of what we are talking about really has anything to do with no King's Day here in the United States, right?
No.
Because the accusation is not that Donald Trump is trying to just be, a figurehead that creates stability. The accusation is one of an absolute democracy. Now, say the thing that maybe people don't want to hear. Do you think that Donald Trump is anywhere close to functioning as an absolute monarch? And what are the features that would lead someone in that direction, and what are the features that wouldn't?
Well, that takes us deeply into the realm of evaluating how executive power has been used in the last 3 months, which I'm happy to talk about. But I want to make one point first, which is in his first term, he said, Mike Pence, why don't you do the day-to-day government and I'll focus on making America great again. So he even kind of imagined himself as being above the actual day-to-day functioning of executive office, that he would just direct things.
The boring stuff.
Do stuff. Yeah, exactly. And so it does seem to be something in his personality. And of course, he's now retweeting these images of himself with crowns. And so, are they just trolling the libs or whatever? I have no idea. But, true monarchs obviously try to integrate the nation and not, divide it. So I don't know about that. Now, could you say the use of executive power so far is monarchical or authoritarian? That seems to be what you're saying. The pattern seems to be do something completely outrageous without thinking very much about it. And then, defy your opponents to take the case to court. But what's critical is that in every case I've seen so far, the administration has, in the end, complied with court orders. It's begrudging, it's foot-dragging, but that's not unusual for executive administration in this country. And, of course, the things that they're doing are much more outrageous than, say, run-of-the-mill president would do. But at the end of the day, it is power that is subject to law. And that, I think, distinguishes it from what we call an absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchs are immune from their own courts and do whatever they want. Here, I just have to say, I think the return of Kilmer Albrego Garcia is really an important case, because if he'd been allowed to languish there in El Salvador because of administrative error, there really would be nothing preventing any of us from being deported. It wouldn't matter if you were a green card holder, or naturalized citizen, natural born citizen. Well, Ginsburg was sent to El Salvador by administrative error. Nothing we could do about it. Imagine what kind of world that would be. That's an authoritarian world, which I certainly don't want to live in. So I think we are in a realm where power is still governed under law-ish for most of the time. And, my vision of the law would be different from what the courts are doing. I'd be much more restrictive, but I don't think it's an absolute monarchy yet, or a dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your last point. I think the way that you framed that is a little bit comforting. I think I see it more as efforts to create friction that will then be escalated. The way that you're characterizing an absolute monarch is as if, the country is just their plaything. But the reality of absolute monarchs is they also have to politic, right? There's still public opinion to worry about. There's still revolution to worry about. There's still rich nobles trying to come and behead you. There's still like a world in which there are other people. And there were weak kings and queens, and there were strong kings and queens, even in moments where that form of governance was most accepted. So I do think that you could look at what Trump is doing as working his way towards having the kind of power that an absolute monarch might have. But let's remember that it's been 6 months.
Yes. Look, I'm not, saying that we're in for a walk in the park here. As you know, I'm very concerned about, certain moves that have been made, the raising the stakes of executive power so high that it's hard to imagine them turning it over to anyone else. Some of the attempts to change, federal election law and things like this. We have to be vigilant, obviously. That's the nature of democracy. You have to be distrustful of government authority for the whole thing to work. And, particularly when the administration's approach is like, let's break a whole bunch of stuff without thinking about it. I think, a lot of damage has been done to our institutions already. So I don't want to come off as like, oh, it's all okay. I'm just talking about from the point of view of what kind of government do we have right now? That's really the question.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of leads me into maybe the broader issue that I was thinking about, and that is related very much to the Human Rights Project. I think you say this a lot, and actually I don't know where it comes from, that democracy is a terrible form of government except for everything else. I don't know who actually said that.
Winston Churchill, actually.
Okay, there you go.
I could get my cigar out right now.
In my mind, it's Tom Ginsburg. But but in any case, the one thing that I worry about in the long term is that, at least in this part of the world, that the idea of democracy will have taken a hit, like a real hit, and even from people on the left. Like, in fact, I think it already has from people on the left, this idea that people didn't know what they were voting for, or that they were tricked. It's like everybody's waiting for all of the people who voted for Trump to realize that they were tricked, or that they weren't tricked, that they actually were voting for a version of like toxic masculine dominance. We've talked about this also in past episodes, and that's what they want. And do we want those people in charge of, deciding what the leadership of the country should look like? So I think that this idea that we are a community and that we elect our leaders, and that's the kind of government that we all trust in and that we think will lead to the best results in the long term, I think that idea is going to be tenuous, after whenever this experience ends. And I guess I want some of your reflections on that, because, Latin America pretty well. I grew up in Latin America, at least for part of my life. And I've just heard that line many times in my life, that like the population doesn't know what's good for them, as justification for these oppressive and intrusive like policy interventions. It's like this soft paternalism. Well, it's a form of paternalism that couches itself as soft but isn't actually soft, right? It's just based on this idea that people are not sufficiently educated or sophisticated enough or to really know how to govern themselves. And that really sends like very, very strong spidey senses off whenever I hear that.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I just wrote a little piece called hyper-presidentialism, which which is a term that we sometimes use to describe Latin American systems or post-Soviet systems, in which so much power is in the presidency that there's no real checks and balances. And I think that's kind of the system they are trying to construct here. And one of the problems with that is it makes it very difficult to give up power. And it leads to a kind of demagogic kind of appeal, populism, personalization of everything, demonization of the enemy. It's really bad. And, we could go down the list of Latin American countries where you see this, and it hasn't worked out well. So I think, another thing that makes us a little more similar to Latin America than we might have been a couple of generations ago is the levels of inequality, which are incredibly persistent in Latin America and have been, of course, since colonial times. And that, I think, is part of what you're describing as, it allows people to say, oh, these poor people, they don't know what's good for them. The elites have to run things. And, poor people can smell that a mile away, and so that tends not to work out. I think that democracy ultimately requires a kind of faith in the long run that the people are going to work things out. And of course, it requires certain protections to make sure that you continue to have fair electoral competition, that you have certain basic rights protected. And I think that that's, what you risk when you have too much power in one branch of government, or you personalize everything that this person alone can save us. No, democracy is about processes and not about personalities, in my view. So it's a kind of fraught time, and I think the Latin American analogy is a really good one that you bring up, honestly. Oh, yeah. So let me say a little bit about Republican systems and how they get this function. We're a presidential system. We have presidential elections, or these kind of winner-take-all elections. They create incentives to have these hyper presidencies. And there's a long literature in political science which says, presidential systems aren't very good. There's a preference for what are called parliamentary systems, where you elect the Congress and then they choose who's going to govern the country. But even in those systems where you have a prime minister, like in the United Kingdom, you don't need to have a queen or king. But you do need someone who serves as head of state. So those systems always have, someone who's the head of state who's not the prime minister. And in many countries, that person is called a president. Italy, for example, elects old, retired politicians who are seen as wise to occupy this seat called the presidency. And they do have some impact. They're supposed to take the long view of the system and make sure that the rules are basically followed and stuff. So I think that's an achievable thing for the United States. We could have a prime minister. We could move to a parliamentary system. And a lot of people have suggested this, that it might be better. We would probably have a more divided set of parties, but it would depend on the electoral rule. It has long been said that minorities would do better under a parliamentary system. If we had a parliamentary system in which you had all these different things, the Democratic Socialists and the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Republicans and the Never-Trumpers and MAGA, and they were all running these different parties, then they have to cobble together some kind of coalition. You would need someone to serve above all that as a president. And those people typically have longer terms. They serve for 8-10 years. And, I could see something like that in the United States. Maybe we'd elect someone everyone liked for that role. Oprah or something like that.
This is a very fundamental what is democracy question. What is it that we actually want from our leaders that are representing us, right? Because I don't think everybody has the same answer. So do we want a member of Congress to be a mouthpiece for their constituency? There's some kind of there's a question and the constituency wants a thing and the member of Congress is just there to advocate for that perspective? Or do we want a member of Congress to have been elected to exercise judgment from their constituency, and so sometimes be able to make decisions that are in opposition to the constituency. Those are two very different forms of leadership, and they're different personalities to democracy. And I think they also lead to different bodies, because if we just want these representative individuals to be mouthpieces, well, first of all, we can probably do that with an algorithm. And second of all, that's really an argument for quotas, because then identity is everything. But if we're actually asking people to exercise their judgment, then we're somewhere else. But anyway, I don't know, this is basic, but what do you say to this?
Wow, that's great. I mean, this is bringing up a whole branch of political theories of representation. And we occasionally have people in the United States who do take stands which are at odds with the majority view of their constituents. And, sometimes they're rewarded, sometimes they suffer. You might think about, Liz Cheney in Wyoming or something like that. Or here's an interesting example, David Valadao, who you may not have heard, but he is a representative in the California district where many of my cousins live. And he voted to impeach Trump. And he's still in Congress, even though it's a majority Republican district. So he voted his conscience, and I'm sure then he stopped talking about it. But that's a good example of how, you elect someone, they exercise their judgment, they're able to get away with it. But I think, if you're too far away, in our system where we have congressional elections every 2 years, it's kind of hard to stay too far away from what your majority of your constituents wants. So anyway, that's a huge and interesting question. Are you just basically a public opinion poll, or you are an agent designed to exercise your own expertise and to get things done that way?
What do you think, Tom? This is a little off topic, but if you had to describe the international human rights system as a democratic system of self-governance, what features of the system would you say actually fit into that description?
I don't think it is a democratic system of self-governance. I think it's different. The international human rights system, so the way to think about it is what's democracy? Democracy is a way people govern themselves, typically, though not essentially, by majority rule. And, in order to make that work, we need certain things to be taken off the table. If the majority could vote, to do anything, they could, for example, you and Hannah and Matt here on this call could have a 3-1 vote that you would, take me and carve up my organs and sell them for, on the organ market. And that would be majority rule.
That got dark really fast. Why?
Well, I don't know. I was trying to get your attention. So, but if you have that kind of, so there has to be some limits in order for us to even be able to talk to each other. And that's the whole phenomenon of what rights are. And human rights, of course, are the idea that, everyone should have these wherever they are. And so in some sense, I think most people who work in international human rights believe that if human rights were really enforced, we would have much more democratic government, obviously. But the chicken and egg problem is you basically need democracies to get those human rights enforced. And there's no natural reason that majorities always want to be granting more rights to minorities and such. So anyway, I think it's kind of a separate category, but ultimately complementary.
I mean, I think the reason...
You look skeptical.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I think that I see features of democratic self-governance in the international human rights system. Now, I recognize that it's very narrow in a way, right? It's a particular form of self-governance. But if you take the principles of the international human rights system, that is the majority, right, the world's population, deciding that it wants to hold those values in their own states and hold each other accountable at the international level. There are ways to vote, right? The General Assembly is sort of like a voting mechanism. And then there are other ways to do things that are more specific and administrative. You're still missing the coercion and, there's all the things that you have in a domestic government. But I think there's still there are bits and features of it. And it's a majority deciding that protection of minorities are an important thing for the majority to thrive in the end, right? I don't know.
I don't know. I think of the UN, I don't think of it as really a democratic system. It's pseudo-democratic, but there's no reason that, 100 and, 20 small nations should be able to, outvote China and India and Indonesia. I'm not sure why that's a moral theory. Why that really makes
Well, it might
sense.
not
Yes,
be
it
right.
uses voting,
Yeah.
but it's not. It's different.
Well, but I mean, it justifies itself though, like because every country is its own unit and is its own sovereign. I mean, we can have annoying conversations about the way that voting happens here in the United States and states having outsized influence, but
Yeah,
it's still a system.
yeah, that's true. There's actually some stuff in the international human rights declarations that almost implies there's a democratic requirement of government.
Yeah.
So, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Okay, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says everyone has the right to take part in the government of their country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in the country, and the will of the people shall be the basis of authority. So, which would be expressed through periodic and genuine elections by universal and equal suffrage with a secret ballot. So that's in the Universal Declaration. And what we see then is that countries like China, which, do claim to be democratic, do have elections with a secret ballot, and do claim that the will of the people is the basis of government. But obviously, these are not freely chosen representative in the sense there's lots of restrictions on who gets to run and such. So,
Yeah.
in any case, there's a lot of language in human rights which sort of hints that there might be some kind of requirement in international law to be a democracy. There's a guy named Thomas Frank who in the early 1990s sort of hinted at this. I disagree with that because even though, of course, I'm a huge fan of democracy, I recognize that it's only really possible under certain social conditions, certain levels of education and wealth and things like this. And you don't want to adopt a rule which makes, 2/3 of the world's governments, presumptively illegitimate. We need to deal with these governments. You need to interact with them. And so is the government of Iran, it's obviously a human rights violating government, clearly violates those provisions and many, many others. But it's still a legitimate member of the international community. And so that's why I'm a little reluctant to push these requirements too far.
Yeah,
It's a
but
matter of
that's
law.
a practical determination. Yeah, I mean I think that's always the balance in the human rights system is that the more you try to hold to a certain kind of principle, the fewer people are, or the fewer entities are participating, right? And we don't want that because then the system wouldn't exist.